When I was 27, my mum watched a documentary that fundamentally changed the direction of my life. At the time, I was in a very dark and dangerous situation. I was in an abusive relationship that I couldn't escape, and I was addicted to heroin and crack. If my mum hadn't seen that programme, which prompted her to get back in touch with me, to help me out of the situation I was in, to give me a chance to get to rehab, I don't know if I'd be stood here today. The documentary that she saw was presented by John Bird, the founder of The Big Issue, and in it he advocated that all addicts should get a chance to go to rehab. Up until that point, my mum had felt powerless to help me, and in fact she'd been told by many people that she shouldn't even try to help me. Tough love, they call it. But seeing that programme gave her a different perspective and a renewed hope that with the right help, that maybe I could get better. That saved my life. I've been a radio broadcaster now for almost 10 years, and looking back, that was a pivotal moment where I really felt that, powerful, challenging storytelling can give the listener or viewer a new perspective, and it can be a catalyst for very powerful change. So back when I was a teenager, I don't think a career in radio ever even occurred to me. I just loved listening to it. I was a massive music geek. I loved listening to all the new bands and the latest DJs on the radio. And and in my 20s, I guess radio became more of a companion to me as I became more and more socially isolated. And I guess radio, TV, daytime TV, and magazines started to replace real people as my life wasn't quite going to plan, which is an understatement of the century. I did have a vague notion that if I managed to get over my troubles at some stage, which seemed unlikely, that I would like to be a journalist of some sort, that I would like to work in radio, but that seemed like a pretty crazy idea. I mean, people like me don't work in radio or even in the media, and I knew a thing or two about crazy ideas, having been under psychiatric care since the age of 12. But it hadn't always been that way. I did start off as a bright and capable student. I had an aptitude for English and drama, but by 14 I'd been admitted to an adolescent psychiatric ward for anorexia, where I spent nearly a year, and by 15 I'd made my first very serious suicide attempt, not my last, and at 16 I was living in a hostel, so my education fell by the wayside. And I found my salvation in clubland, fueled by my passion for music and also my growing enthusiasm for drugs and alcohol. By 19, my substance misuse and suicidal behaviour had escalated, and I was admitted to my first detox. And it wasn't the last by a long stretch. The next 10 years carried on in this vein, binging, starving, detoxes, drinking, drugging, eating disorder units, and in the latter years, police cells, homelessness, and utter desperation. There were also many attempts to get clean, so there were brief periods of recovery, the odd job, even a trip to a Buddhist monastery in Thailand, and that's a whole other story. It was not how I had planned my life at all. And in the background, I guess, was always music and radio, particularly. There was something just so grounding about it. I found that intimacy of just a human voice playing some tunes. I found it so comforting. And, it gave me a window into a world I no longer felt part of. My own career in radio started pretty unusually. That's another understatement. At the age of 28, I'd washed up in yet another detox. Prior to that, I was homeless. I was deeply traumatized. I turned up there skeletal with a cracked rib, septicemia, and 3 warrants out for my arrest. I thought it was a done deal that I'd go to prison at that point, but luckily for me, I had someone advocating on my behalf, and my criminal justice worker managed to get some funding for me to go to rehab rather than prison. I was really lucky, really, really lucky. If I hadn't had someone advocating for me, if I hadn't been white, well-spoken, if I hadn't had access to services that just simply don't exist anymore, that might not have happened. But it did, and I went to an all-female treatment centre in Gloucestershire called the Nelson Trust. I definitely didn't want to go there. I didn't think I really liked women, and I definitely didn't want to go to Gloucestershire, but I did. You know, I was out of my own ideas by this point. I just followed what was in front of me. And what I found was that in that all-female environment, for the first time in my life, I started to be able to be honest about everything. The drugs, the food problems, the relationships, everything. And I started to heal, and I started to make real connections with other women. And yeah, and in that treatment centre, they had like lots of therapeutic activities as you sort of graduated through the treatment programme. And they had things like gardening group, aromatherapy, creative writing. And luckily for me, they had a radio skills group run by the local community radio station Stroud FM, which sadly also no longer exists. But yeah, I loved it and went for it, and I learned some basic radio skills. I learned how to drive a desk, I learned how to record, how to edit, how to do a basic interview, how to put a news report together. Had some extremely Partridge moments. One of my first news reports was about a swan couple getting divorced. That was definitely a very proud moment for me still. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. I really loved it, and it was fun. It was fun, you know. And really, all I wanted at that time was just to be cool and play some nice tunes on the radio, like Stroud's own answer to Mary Ann Hobbs. Probably more like Partridge, but yeah. But what I found was I got so much more than that. So with a microphone in my hand, I had a license to go and talk to people, to become part of my community again, to learn. I learned to communicate, I learned to listen, and I learned to become part of the world. And it is a cliche, but I started to find my own voice. And through fantastic mentorship and teachers and the support of the people around me, I gained the confidence to apply to uni from there. And I remember I turned up at uni, I had no IT skills. Obviously I'd flunked my education. I didn't have any academic skills to speak of. And I remember in my first year crying because I couldn't double space a Word document, and I just felt too stupid to ask. But I did get through, and I did complete my degree. In fact, I graduated with a first, and and I got a couple of awards, and then after that I got into a scheme at the BBC. That was a pretty weird trip. I went in 4 years from being street homeless and addicted to drugs to working as an assistant at BBC Radio 4. That was kind of hard to process emotionally, I guess. Talk about imposter syndrome. I had it in absolute spades. I was terrified of being found out, absolutely terrified. I just didn't want anyone to know about my past, of course. I just thought if I can just blend in and act normal, no one will notice. So I did do that. It's quite a lonely way to live, and it's pretty tiring too. One day, we were making a programme about addiction, funnily enough, and I thought, actually, my life experience is pretty relevant here. So I confided in the producer that I was working with that I was actually in recovery myself. And she said to me, "Ooh, I'd keep that to yourself." And fair play, I absolutely believe she had my best interest at heart, that she knew that that's not a safe thing to say out loud in many spaces, particularly not in the office. And I believe she was trying to protect me. But what I guess the message I guess I received at that point was, it's okay for us to make programs about these kinds of people, but it's not all right for us to be these kinds of people. So yeah, I kept quiet for a few more years. But as time was passing, I was getting increasingly frustrated at media representations I saw of things that I knew well. They often, things like mental illness, addiction, eating disorders, etc., all the fun things in life. They often seemed oversimplified, stereotyped, and I wasn't hearing anything new or much depth to these stories. And it annoyed me so much that I decided I'd try and do something about it. And through a series of chance meetings, I managed to get myself a meeting with the editor of Woman's Hour at Radio 4 to pitch some story ideas to her. And these story ideas came from my own life and from my friends in recovery's lives. Yeah, so I sort of went into this room, this kind of weird cell at the BBC, and I started pitching these stories to her, and she was kind of like this, and I was sort of I was quite nervous. But it seemed like I was telling her some things that she hadn't heard before, and that was quite unusual, I suppose, in the world that she lived in, where they covered kind of everything a million times, and she was hearing maybe some new angles on things. And then I said, and actually I'd like to present all these features as well. And she said, well, why on earth would you, a complete unknown, present these features when we have presenters who present the features? And I said, well, because I've got lived experience of every story I've just pitched you. And cue massive awkward silence. That's like a classic overshare from me there. Something I've now made a career out of. But yeah, I didn't really mean to say that. I didn't come in with a plan, but it just came out of my mouth, really, as often very inappropriate things do. And it wasn't your average job interview by any stretch. But after a sort of weird little moment, she said, well, yes, so you should then. And so off I went to make these stories. And I guess I got that sense that I was onto something, that actually the things that I tried to hide about myself, the worst things I'd been through in life, might actually be the things that gave me a distinct voice and allowed me to tell stories that really mattered to me. So, yeah, I went off and I made the first feature. And the first feature I made was about self-harm scars in adulthood. It was something that came directly from my own experience. It wasn't something I'd ever seen covered in the mainstream media. We'd never met before that interview, but we connected. I had a sense of what questions to ask her, and, we cried together. It was a deeply moving experience, and I believe because of the connection that we had and the shared experience that we had, that we were able to tell a really deep and honest and unflinching story. I didn't react with shock or discomfort when she told me the details of her life, and I think that helped. So that was the first story, the first report I did. And after that, my housemate at the time, someone who, to my knowledge, has never had any sort of problems with his mental health, and who'd said to me, you know what, I've never been able to understand why people self-harm. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all. He said, but after hearing that interview, I can kind of get it. And that, to me, is kind of spurred me on. I knew that's really what I'm trying to do. I did carry on, and I made some more stuff, and things seemed to be going very well. But it's worth a quick note here that, personally in the background, although my career was ascending, things were very, very difficult. I stopped looking after myself. I started driving myself way too hard, and eventually I relapsed after a number of years in recovery, and I thought I'd lost everything I'd worked for, and it looked like I might not make it back again. But I did. I was lucky again. And I say that because I just don't want anyone to think that my life is like some Hollywood film with some, neat, happy resolution that we journalists are so fond of. It's been full of falls and failures and slips and first, second, third, fourth, fifth chances and a lot of luck and a lot of support. And that's important for me to say. Recovery is not a straight line. But I, again, was lucky and I got another chance and eventually I got back to health, and straight out of rehab, I got commissioned again by Woman's Hour to make a series about women leaving prison. Something I did have some experience of and seemed quite ironic considering I was just coming back off a relapse. I met some incredible women along the way for this series, and after that had gone out, there was some amazing feedback, and then I resumed work on the series that I'd pitched 3 years previously, which was about women and addiction, women's unique experiences of addiction and recovery. And I made the decision that I would author this series myself. I hadn't done that up until that point. I talked to the women I spoke to off air, but I hadn't said on air, this is me too. And I thought long and hard about it, but the reason that I needed to do it was because as I started to research the series, one of the first things that came up was this issue of stigma. Stigma is huge still for addiction and many other things. For women, there's even more addiction. Okay, I probably could kind of sense that. But also that stigma is one of the main barriers to treatment. So if you remove the stigma, people are more likely to seek help. And if people seek help, then they are less likely to die. So at that point, I knew I had to share my own story, that it mattered if I did or not. I couldn't contribute to this stigma in any way, shape, or form. And I couldn't ask these women to share their stories if I didn't also share some of mine. It's never been an easy thing for me to do. It doesn't feel safe or comfortable to admit this stuff in a public space. It just doesn't. It still doesn't. I do it because it matters to me. It matters that I'm not silenced by my own shame or by the stigma that society has put upon me and my friends and my fellows. That's why it matters to me. And I was given a very generous amount of airtime to really get into the complexity of these women's lives. It started off as just a couple of ideas, and it became a 9-part series that now lives online. You can still listen to it here. These stories that I heard were raw, they were tragic, and they were real. And they were absolutely human, and each woman demonstrated so much hope and so much resilience. They were stories that went beyond the sensational headlines and statistics that we're also used to seeing that breed more fear and disempowerment, separation from our fellow humans. I said at the start that I believe that truth can be a catalyst for change, and often the truth is uncomfortable. And I believe this to be true because it's something that I've experienced in my own life in many ways. It wasn't until I could accept the truth that I was an addict that I could start to open my mind to new solutions and start to heal. And it wasn't until I faced up to the reality of my past that I could start to move on from it. When it comes to storytelling, I believe it's important that we hear new voices, new perspectives, new experiences, so that we can find new solutions to old problems. Last year at this event, Marina from the Forgiveness Project, lovely Marina, said that she believes the stories we tell today shape the world we live in tomorrow. And I also believe that, and I absolutely believe that those stories need to have more empathy, more nuance, more forgiveness, more honesty. As you remember at the start of my talk, I spoke about the time my mum saw a documentary which, made her take quite a radical step, which changed my life at the time. And last year, the first part of the series I made for Woman's Hour went out. And in this first story, this first report, I went back to the treatment centre, the all-female one that I was in Gloucestershire, the Nelson Trust, and I spoke to women there about the benefits of treating women in an all-female environment. And that was also the treatment centre that I made my very first radio programme at, if you remember, and that went out, and a couple of days later, I got an email from the Nelson Trust. And they said that after hearing my report, they'd been contacted by a woman who said she was going to give her addicted daughter a chance to go to rehab. She was going to put her in, or help her get into rehab that week. And I guess that's why I'm here today, and that's why I feel I need to keep sharing my dark past, as uncomfortable as it may feel, because I truly believe it has the power to open up the door to a brighter future for someone else.